half a day from this beautiful island. Now, half a day is a greeting here on Guam, much like aloha in Hawaii, or maybe in South Florida, you might say, hi, y'all. Or in Texas, you might say howdy, or you might say none of that. But that's what we say here on Guam, which is a United States territory in the Western Pacific. Some of you may have been here and know where we are. Some of you may have an idea. And some of you might think we're right by Hawaii. And that's true if by right by you mean 3,750 miles west of Oahu. In fact, Oahu is closer to Denver or Dallas than it is to Guam. Prove me wrong. In any case, we're not here to talk about geography today. We're here to talk about photography and our subject about macro and super macro. So have you ever wondered how dive guides can find creatures that you would never see? While a lot of that expertise is related to the fact that they're repeatedly diving the same sites, they also have refined skills and knowledge of where, how, and what to look for. So today, I'm going to give you some of my techniques and arm you maybe with a little knowledge that can increase your success with macro and super macro photography. First, though, we're going to have a little bit of techno nerd stuff. While divers may apply the macro label to any dive where the emphasis is on smaller creatures, in photography, technically, it means using specialized equipment to capture a subject and its image on the camera sensor at the same size. In other words, a half-inch high subject is going to be a half-inch on the sensor. For dedicated macro lenses, this ratio will coincide with the closest the lens can achieve focus on the subject, or minimum focus distance. The majority of non-macro lenses cannot achieve this ratio at any distance. In such cases, you need additional magnification to get there. Similarly, super macro means any magnification ratio greater than 1:1. In this case, further specialized equipment or modes let you focus closer to the subject than the macro distance, which renders the subject's sensor image bigger than the subject. For interchangeable lens cameras, while there's some dedicated super macro lenses on the market, like the OM Systems 90 that came out recently, underwater photographers will typically achieve super macro either with internal gear, like a teleconverter or extension tube, or external gear, like a wet diopter. Compact cameras vary by make. Super macro might require a powerful diopter or not, or a special photo mode. Since you can't remove internal gear underwater, you're in essence committed to its magnification for the whole dive. Conversely, you can generally attach or remove something like a wet diopter underwater, so that provides you some flexibility. Now the TG7, it was a TG6 when I first built this, is an outlier in that it's a compact camera that can achieve up to 4 times magnification at its minimum focus distance, which is less than ½ an inch. So really, the most popular choice for most photographers is going to be a wet diopter. This will provide compact shooters, macro or super macro, and it'll provide macro shooters with a macro lens, super macro. It's really flexible if you have a flip holder because you can bring 2 of different strengths. The stronger the diopter, the closer you can get to the subject. But there's a catch, they don't focus to infinity like a macro lens does, which means they can be really hard to use, and the stronger they are, the harder they are to use. So you really got to be careful, you got to be skilled, you got to practice, and you got to make sure that you're watching out for the habitat. Now personally, I find fulfillment from 3 aspects of macro and super macro photography. First, and what we're mostly talking about today, is going to be the thrill of the hunt. That's finding creatures that you can consistently image well. Second would be the art and science of image making. Are you shooting for identification purposes, what I would call a field guide photo, or are you after something a little bit more artistic? And then the third thing I enjoy is image processing, where the modern tools, software that we have lets us maximize the impact of our photos. Now, with that, there is a caveat, especially for newer processors, is beware the perils of overprocessing. Like I like to say, slow your roll on those saturation and texture sliders, pal. Now, most photographers will find super macro or macro challenging at first. So I'm going to offer you some of my personal tips and techniques. One of the things I like to do is to start each dive with a test shot on a larger subject, like a bigger nudie, eel, maybe an octopus, maybe just a piece of coral or a cooperative fish. And that also tests out my whole system, my strobes and everything else, so I can get things pretty dialed in before I shoot for real. And now if you're new, that might be all you can do for the whole dive. Just use the macro lens or the macro mode, and that's fine. Not everybody is ready to go find Shaun the sheep on their very first macro dive. And I would say that the standard guidance you always hear about underwater photography in general will hold for macro as well, with a few additions or exceptions. First, get close to your subject, and if you think you're close enough, get closer. Except not so close that you ruin your composition. Now, every once in a while, a photo of the threads of a nudibranch's rhinophores is exactly what you want. You want to show that, and that's great. But by and large, most people, yourself included, are going to want to see a little bit more of your subject. Second, shoot up. If you can't shoot up, shoot level. Except some macro subjects might be more interesting when you shoot down on them. For example, a pair of nudibranchs that are mating. You might get your best shot down or a little bit shooting down. And then thirdly, compose with your fins first and your zoom lever second. This is particularly applicable to compact camera shooters. I've seen people where they just can't get the shot they want and then they start to zoom in and out. And you're going to basically get your best shot, macro or super macro, when you're zoomed all the way in and then you use your body or your fins to position yourself in relation to the subject. As with everything, there's exceptions here too, because sometimes the geography doesn't let you do that. You have to zoom. Typically, face shots are going to be the most dramatic on a macro subject, especially if it has eyes, and you want to have those in sharp focus. If you can't get the face, then shoot from the side. If you can't get the side, then take a top-down shot, unless, again, a top-down shot is your objective. And only rarely are rear shots, what I call politely fish butt photos, viable. Except when you want to identify a creature that you maybe have never seen before and you're going to put it out somewhere for expert opinion, then you might want shots from all aspects or all angles, because all things might matter to get the proper ID. And then, last, you're going to obey your compositional guidelines in the camera, if you can. Except some subjects are so small or in so tight a space or are so uncooperative that you are best off just putting them in the middle and composing in post. Remember, the subject gets a vote. I personally am a Lightroom Classic user. That's what I like to use as my primary processing software. And I use the golden ratio crop overlay guide when I'm processing. If you don't know what that is, then please in Q&A you can ask. It's a crop guide overlay. For Supermacro, you might want to start out getting closer on an inanimate or inert subject first until you get yourself acclimated to being that close to your subject. Things like a rock or coral or a larger tunicate. It takes a lot of practice and adjustment to get as close as you need to be to obtain focus with a strong diopter, +10 or greater. Some people even struggle with less powerful diopters. Until you're comfortable with the equipment, you risk injuring or damaging the subject or the environment if you're just trying to go and bull in and get the shot. Likewise, keep your heads up. In the same vein, you want to alternate your view between the camera and the setting. You're going to find an amazing thing. When you're looking at the subject and you go into the camera, you can't find it. It's plain as can be, and now you can't find it. So what you want to do is when you're looking up is pay attention to what's around there. What are some things that stand out when you're looking at the subject with your eye that you can easily see in the viewfinder or the LCD? So for example, let's say you're imaging a small transparent shrimp that's just to the side of a yellow tunicate. Well, the yellow tunicate is probably easier to find than the shrimp, so you go and you find that, and then you move the camera towards where the shrimp was in your view, and you'll probably find it. If you're super macro and you're shooting a subject that's on or near the bottom, another thing to avoid is what I call snow plowing with your diopter or your port and then just drowning the whole subject, or worse for everybody, silting out the whole area. Lastly, Again, in the same idea, keep it good for everybody. You should agree with other shooters in advance on a protocol before the dive. Personally, I recommend a 3-and-out approach if there's a lot of shooters. Whoever gets there first takes 3 shots and goes to the back of the line. If your 3 shots aren't what you want, well, you tried. You get another shot when it's your turn again. Approach the subject slowly and from its level. Don't try to do the massive swoop down onto a small leaf or a small subject. You'll probably scare some of them, and others you might ruin them. If you're in a mucky or silty area, it's a really, really great idea to carry around a muck stick and maybe move yourself around with that versus even finning or moving your arms, depending on how strong it is. Eventually, the main limit to discovery is going to be your ability to explore close enough to discern what in the world it is you're seeing. That's because the smaller you get or the more you magnify, the more skill it requires, like we talked about. The strongest wet diopters, like the Nauticam SMC2 or the Kraken KRL 06S, are in the plus 23 range. AOI makes one too. That's a hard limit for most of us. They focus very close to the subject, and their depth of field is extremely narrow. So you got to be right on to get it, and you can't really move back or forward much. You just have to get in that exact right spot and get the image. Which again, because you're so close, will now make your lighting a little bit more challenging. So again, it's a great thing to go out and do a lot of and to practice every opportunity you get so you can get better and better and better. To some say wide angle is harder, but for me, I think macro and super macro is kind of the ultimate challenge for underwater photographers. So here are my golden rules for spotting. And what we need to know is, I've talked a lot about seeing things so far, but the fact is that spotting and finding creatures is easily as much about brain work as it is eye work. So first, the golden rules for spotting and shooting are to investigate anything that breaks up the pattern and flow. Is it a different color than its background? Is it perhaps moving? If it's moving, is it moving with a purpose? Like if you're in water with a little bit of movement, which is almost always, and maybe there's a little bit of particulate in the water. If the particulate is moving left and you see something moving right, that might be something to go look at. Or if it's going from leaf to leaf or thing to thing, probably something to look at. Does it stop? Does it stop long enough for you to get a shot, etc. So some general techniques for spotting and shooting. Go slow. Almost all divers, and especially new divers, go way too fast to find the really small stuff. If you slow down, another benefit is you'll breathe less, you'll see more, you'll last longer on your bottom time. Get low. I think there's an inverse relationship between your distance from the bottom and the probability of finding something. Even if you're just 1 to 2 feet, half a meter or so above the bottom, you're going to find more things if you cut that in half, and so on. Of course, you might miss that manna mating with a mermaid above you, but hey, life's all about choices, right? However, you got to have really good buoyancy, which ties back to you probably want to have a pretty good amount of experience as a diver before you take on photography in earnest, and especially macro photography. As far as your fin techniques go, or your muck stick, I use my muck stick to move slowly across the bottom and try to avoid finning at all in silty or sandy areas. That's why it's called muck diving. When I'm done shooting, I use my stick to push myself up and away from the bottom, again, to minimize the silt. You need to study. Again, it's as much brain work as it is eye work. You want to learn where, what, or how various creatures live, eat, or mate. Are they nocturnal? Are they diurnal? Are males and females different? Are they hermaphrodites? How about juveniles and adults? Do they look different? What I recommend is you buy really good field guides and look through them and read them and reference them. And if you're really into it, maybe look at some scholarly articles on potential subjects. Talk with other divers. Talk with dive professionals. Talk with marine biologists if you've got marine biologist friends or your local college or university has a marine biology department. You'll find that the diving community is very friendly and forthcoming. Now you also want to magnify. Now that's not on my slide, but many underwater camera systems offer magnifying viewfinders, and they are a boon to spotting. So if that's an option for you in your system, you should definitely get one of those. Some cameras will offer in-camera magnification. My personal process is to scan with my naked eye before I go to the magnifier and the diopter. I've had pretty good success with that. Conversely, my wife likes to search with a less powerful diopter and her magnifying viewfinder, and then she'll flip to the more powerful diopter if she needs it, if the situation mandates. Another thing is to master shooting in a current. For macro and super macro, it's a lot easier to shoot if you're faced into the current than if you're going with it. It's almost impossible in a current if you're going with it to shoot and get anything. So you might have to make yourself stable, thin yourself, however you need to do it to hold yourself steady and, again, respect the environment. Check behind you as well. If it's a really strong current, hey, may not be the day for super macro, maybe just macro. A really strong current, enjoy the ride and wish you had your wide angle lens, or be lucky if you have a TG7 or something you can shoot with. So some other ideas are to investigate everything and use magnification, and I'm going to go through all the specific things that are listed here. And then if you are guiding or you're helping others, help the other photographer. Point to them, not only just point to the subject, but point in the direction they should go in order to get the shot they want, typically a face shot or a head shot. So, what am I going to look at? What am I going to look at? What am I going to look for? So here's some specific things that I have found, and these are my photos I want to show you. The first one is those ugly sea cucumbers. Well, guess what? They pick up a lot of hitchhikers on there. They're the ocean's rideshare service. If you may find a nudibranch like I did here, a shrimp, a crab, definitely emperor shrimp is a prize to find, even small fish. And yes, take a peek inside the anus if the cucumber is the type to dilate it. Fish and crabs hang out there, I'm not kidding. Good luck shooting that or explaining it to your mom. The second thing I like to look at are hydroids or hydrozoans. Very often you're going to find things like skeleton shrimp or nudibranchs or even small shrimp and crabs on these hydroids. I found the cleaner hydroids are a little more target rich than those that are covered in what we proverbially call schmutz, dirt, dust, muck, whatever, sand. But you can see that there's a lot of life on these things that look like they're ferns. They're not. They're stinging animals. Sponges. Sponges are at many dive sites. The thing is, sponges are a primary food source for many nudibranchs. We often find whipped coral gobies on them. We find crab, shrimp, and even frogfish in and around sponges. So that's a great example of that. Leaves and algae. I used to see this stuff and go, oh, this site is so boring. There's nothing but algae here. It's terrible. Until I found out that algae is one of the greatest sources of food for small creatures in the ocean, as well as shelter, as well as habitat. It's a fantastic opportunity and resource to investigate. Now, two of the common ones we have on Guam are Avrinvalea and Halimeda. Both have pipefish, slugs, crustaceans. We've found pygmy squid on them. Now, the Avrinvalea is very prized because that's where your Sean the sheep lives. They're sacoglossans. They're not nudibranchs. They're sap-sucking slugs, so they're related. They're in the Costaciella genus. They are, of course, called Sean the sheep, misnamed sometimes as sheep nudies. And one of the ones I just want to point out here is the hairy shrimp. For me, that was my Mount Everest. That was the one that I didn't think I could ever find. And guides would find them, and I would go, how in the world did they find that thing? And then about 2 years ago or so, I found one on a piece of algae. I investigated it. Oh, it's a shrimp. And now we're finding them frequently. It's repeat, and you get into a habit pattern and know where to look, and you go, guess what? You go find. Another great thing to investigate are eggs. These creatures are prolific. maters, and egg layers. And they will lay their eggs on many different surfaces to include the bottom. Look closely and you might see creatures on there, either traversing it or eating. Snails like to eat it. Phavorinus species nudibranchs eat the eggs of other nudies. One of the most interesting things we found on Guam was when we found Phavorinus nudis inside egg masses of other mollusks. And they were eating them from the inside out, and sometimes even laying their own eggs there, which kind of added insult to injury. And there's a photo here of that exact thing. Sea stars. Again, before you dive, maybe your friends go, "Oh, starfish, look at that. Oh, fantastic, it was blue." There's a bazillion of them, at least out here in the Pacific. So in and of themselves, not terribly interesting as photo subjects. But on them, we very frequently find commensal shrimp. And they will assume often the color of their host. And if you're really lucky, you'll find a hostile little bugger called a harlequin shrimp that is feasting on one. Sometimes they'll eat it, rip off an arm, eat it, and then when it grows back, they'll repeat it. So they are pretty amazing little creatures, and they are not too afraid of divers. So if you see one of those, it's a great photo subject. Then there's bottles and other trash. You know, one person's trash is another person's treasure, and yes, we bemoan the fact that there's so much trash in our oceans. And while the proliferation of garbage at dive sites is troubling, some items are actually attractive shelters for sea life. We've got lots of images of small octopus and fish hanging out inside of bottles. The outside can also provide a good surface for nudibranchs and other creatures to crawl around on. Then wood, sticks, things like that stick up from the bottom. They provide landing places for small cephalopods, shrimp, whip coral gobies, tiny clams. We found all kinds of things on just picking up little sticks or looking at leaves. Those derelict leaves that blow in from the land, well, they sit on the bottom and they actually provide some shelter, protection, maybe even food for some of the creatures down there. So it's really exciting. And sometimes we'll pick something up like a coconut husk and we'll find a small cardinal fish with a male with eggs in its mouth, which I'm going to get to in a minute. We haven't found a coconut octopus on Guam, but hey, there's always hope. Then tunicates, sea squirts. In some places, there's tons of skeleton shrimp on them, particularly in the Philippines. It's quite amazing. And also, nudibranchs. They are an attractive spot for a lot of different subjects who will pick up what the tunicate misses when it filter feeds. And then there's the under or backside of corals. You're swimming by that big coral head with a gap on the bottom. Maybe you look in that gap. What you might find there is someone like cheese ball, a little juvenile yellow boxfish. Or you might find a cardinal fish where all of the male of the species that we have discovered so far mouth brood the female's eggs for about a 10-day period. And I can step you through that if you have questions about that. It's a very interesting discovery. So look definitely where the sun doesn't necessarily shine. And finally, you need to be ethical about thinking and shooting small. Avoid touching or moving creatures to get that killer shot. Really, there's always tomorrow, there's the next dive trip. Have consideration for the creatures, respect for the environment, and for other people in the water. Mind the bottom, be conscientious, particularly when you're shooting at a true muck site. Use a muck stick, watch those fin tips. So that's really all I've got. I've shared you some of my starter tips as well as a sample of what a patient diver can find using some really simple guidelines. Remember, it's as much brain work as it is eye work, and I'll be ready to take your questions. Thank you.